We can perform several self-release techniques for the front of the thighs and the front of the hip using the roller. So we can use the roller to target the TFL, anterior quads, and then we can add some knee flexion on top of that as well. So these techniques can be performed on both legs at the same time, or can be performed unilaterally. And we can put the hip in different degrees of rotation to try and target different areas of the quadriceps. And then we can also turn this into an active release technique by performing active knee flexion while we're rolling over the roller. We can come up into the hip and place some pressure on TFL by turning the body more side on and rolling over the TFL like so. So if we have some restrictions through TFL, we can use another self-release technique for that. So basically finding your TFL usually sits between the ASIS, the bony part at the front of the pelvis, and the greater trochanter, the bony part on the side of the hip, placing the ball in that area, and then taking the body weight on the ball, and again performing circles or performing movements around that area until you hit areas of increased tension or tightness, and then basically holding that sustained pressure or performing very small circles around that area of tightness. Yeah. So we can perform a passive stretch for the hip flexors in a lunge position with the affected side behind. And from here, initiating a strong posterior pelvic tilt. So we're basically trying to tuck the pelvis in, performing that posterior pelvic tilt to bring on that stretch. And then from there, gently gliding the pelvis forwards. Ideally, we should have the back ankle in dorsiflexion to try and increase a little bit of that tension through the posterior chain, and avoid going into lumbar extension. So we want to maintain that posterior pelvic tilt, maintain that neutral lumbar position as we glide the pelvis forward so that we're isolating the stretch to the hip and thigh. We can change the bias of the hip flexor stretch to target more of the psoas muscle by incorporating a side lean of the trunk away from the stretching side. We can change the bias of the hip flexor stretch to target more of the rectus femoris by bringing the back leg into knee flexion so that more of the stretch is felt in the quadriceps. We can perform the split squat, which is typically used as a strengthening exercise for the front leg. We can also use this as an active flexibility exercise for the back leg. So if we're targeting the left leg in a right split squat position, slowly lowering down in the movement and allow that lengthening into extension through the hip of the back leg. We can progress that exercise with the use of a bench by performing the movement as a rear leg elevated split squat, and therefore increasing the amount of stretch on both the hip flexors but also on the quadriceps. So we can address some hip extension restrictions with the use of a band or a strap as a self-performed mobilisation with movement. The most typical directions that we perform these movements in are one of posterior glide, so having the strap or belt around the front of the hip so that the belt is applying a anterior-posterior glide, and then maintaining that glide, moving the hip into extension. We may also perform that using an anterior glide. So this time with the strap around the back of the hip, and from there moving into hip extension with that strap performing that posterior-anterior glide. And then we may also want to perform the movement as a lateral glide, so having the strap on the inside of the groin, pulling outwards as we move into hip extension.